Hello everyone, and thank you for coming. Welcome to one of our SoAH Presents events. SoAH, for those who don't know, is a School of Arts and Humanities at the Royal College of Art. We have several research clusters, 6 to be clear, in the school. And each term, one of the clusters does a SoAH Presents, where they invite speakers to talk about an issue, a problematic, a subject that pertains to their research cluster. So tonight we have Sites and Situations, the research cluster, and they are presenting, in fact, Josie Berry, I think, is going to present the actual speakers. And I just also want to say that the next term's one will be Radical Matter, so please watch out for theirs. And then in the autumn, it'll be material engagement. So, you know, as I said, do keep your eyes open. They are all designed in a similar kind of way. So I just want to thank a few people, if you can bear with me for a few minutes. So I want to thank Josie Kane, who's one of the co-directors of Sites and Situations, the other one being Jasper Joseph Lester. I want to also thank Josie Berry, who's done an awful lot of work as well on organising tonight, and Melanie Jackson, who is also one of the organisers. And I would finally like to thank, I don't know if she's still here, Emma Mathis, who's done an awful lot of great... Hello, Emma at the back, who's been making sure that everything runs smoothly and everyone knows what's happening. And hopefully everyone will get paid. So thank you, Emma. So I'm now going to hand over. I'm really excited about this talk. I think this is a really great event and just the kind of thing we should be doing. But I'm going to hand over now to, I'm going to hand over now to Melanie Jackson, who's going to do the first introduction. Thank you.
Tonight, I'm just going to talk about the kind of the reasons for bringing the speakers together this evening. An extraordinary range of intellectual thinking has been introduced to art education over the last 50 years, from philosophy to critical theory, psychoanalysis, sociology, cybernetics, politics, architecture, visual and other sensory cultures. It also embraces subculture, popular culture, esoteric realms, the local and the global, in addition to studying the practices of art making itself. This radical transdisciplinarity is not with an expectation to turn all artists into theorists or academics, but to harbour what John Roberts has called techniques of indiscipline. Indiscipline implies a creative response, an attitude of negation and a challenge through new forms and methods of production and perspectival thinking, to acknowledge a means of transfiguring convention and challenging the given with creative possibility. And as a member of the Sites and Situations cluster and a member of the sculpture programme, I'm delighted you can join us this evening to bring your work from the disciplines of architecture and cultural studies into the purview and discourses of art and the programmes of SoAH. I'm excited to discover the ways that your methods and subjects and approach to issues as representation, spatial organisation, justice and injustice, the archive and cartographies opens up new possibilities and possibilities of transfiguration. I'm going to hand over to Josie now, who's just going to introduce the themes of the everyday.
Thanks everyone for coming. So welcome to Matters of Everyday Life and Death. It's a pun on a film, for those of you who don't know, called A Matter of Life and Death, which is a 1946 Pressburger and Powell film about a character played by David Niven who is, he has to jump out of his Lancaster bomber that has been shot down by the Nazis, enemy fire, and he comes down and he sort of, for the remainder of the film, caught between two realms, struggling to save himself in the earthly and celestial realms from his pre-allocation to death. And I won't give away the end of the story, but there was something about this kind of being betwixt and between that seemed very pertinent to the question of everyday life. This sort of being both between something formal and informal, the way that the everyday life kind of sets up a series of interfaces, you could say. So the everyday as a phrase and a theoretical field of inquiry marks the meeting point of supposedly quotidian life with general conditions, power relations, mass objects, policies, atmospheres, institutions, and infrastructures that inform, transform, and invest it. It marks the most common sites of experience, but it's also a highly unstable category that can feel a bit like a trap. Whose everyday is the first logical response to any attempt to generalize the term. So to invoke it is, of course, to invoke the myriad intersectionally, geopolitically, and environmentally different ways in which life is experienced, in ways that can be which can really quickly feel like stepping into quicksand. How do we generalize? Whose right is it to look and to speak of the drudgery, the struggles, the unnoticed ones, or hours or moments, the dark hallways, and the improvisations of the everyday? Yet, the minute one starts to kind of disparage the concept and the notion, then comes the kind of contrary position. But if we invalidate it, if we invalidate this term, then we sort of ignore and overstep what has been an incredibly important realm of historical research and practice, both on the kind of molecular and I suppose the more formal scales. And we could say that historically, writers, artists, scholars, and activists have taken hold of this very unstable zone as a site from which to act, to think, to describe, to resist, to reinvent, and to aestheticize the places and ways in which we spend the majority of our lives. So the everyday, or the every night, as it also has been called, and I think that's a really important thing to remember, that in using this term as often as we do and unthinkingly as we do, we often overstep the really important ways in which people experience night, depending on a whole range of what might be described as intersectional or positional conditions. Here I'm thinking of a really interesting article that I read in the Funambulist magazine about apartheid South Africa, in which in essentially the kind of slum areas, people living there were subject to these enormous, very, very high lamps which cast light down and that over-illuminated the nighttime, so that there was never an experience of darkness. Okay, so obviously it's this kind of contestable subject. It's slippery, but it's vital to think about and think through and think with. So the everyday or the every night is the space of habit and monotony, as much as flashes of beauty, invention, and imagination. In fact, one actually compels the other. The habit compels the need to reinvent, and the reinvention transforms the habit. As Saidiya Hartman has said, beauty is not a luxury. Rather, it is a way of creating possibility in the space of enclosure. So in other words, the everyday kind of solicits aesthetics. It demands aestheticization in order to kind of withstand its pressures, its pains, its horribleness, which is a word she uses, but also its monotony. So the everyday is a contradictory notion. It's porous, informal, and atmospheric, and yet also structural, systematic, and relentless. A site of subtle sensations and fine-grained experiences which filtrate, internalize, and recode the impacts of power, structures, social orders, and often crisis. So today, we have the privilege of welcoming our two wonderful speakers, Nishat Awan and Ben Highmore, to present their research into everyday life spaces and places Each of them will speak about sites or spaces or temporalities of unsettlement, precarity, but also, I think, hope and reinvention from quite different perspectives. So first up, we'll have Nishat Awan, who is Professor of Architecture and Visual Cultures at UCL Urban Laboratory. Her research and writing focuses on diasporas, migration, and border regimes. She is interested in modes of spatial representation, particularly in relation to the digital and the limits of witnessing as a form of ethical engagement with distant places. Nishat will screen and discuss her video essay, Pahaar, or Mountains, within the context of a long-term research project on displacement. The film shifts across border landscapes and villages in Pakistan and Turkey, exploring the hopes and desires of those who make perilous journeys across hostile borders. And then that presentation will be followed by Ben Highmore's, and Ben is Professor of Cultural Studies in the School of Media, Arts and Humanities at the University of Sussex. His most recent books are Lifestyle Revolution, How Tastes Change Class in Late 20th Century Britain, 2023, and Playgrounds, The Experimental Years, 2024. He's currently working on yet another two book projects. One is on the painter Frank Bowling, and the other is on the state and potential of the humanities at a moment of multiple global emergencies. And Ben will be talking about spaces of anticipatory reparation in a range of examples from adventure playgrounds to hospices. So thanks very much. Let's give our speakers a warm welcome. And
so thank you very much for that introduction and also for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And thanks so much to the whole of the Sites and Situations group for inviting me. So the title of the event, as we sort of just discussed, Matters of Everyday Life and Death, is really apt, I think, for speaking about the kinds of research that I do, which is, related to migration and borders. In very simple ways, the way that borders allow and disallow movement across them is very much a matter of life and death. We know that from kind of the images we see on the news, people drowning in the Mediterranean, and recently we've heard that, Trump has opened Guantanamo Bay to unlawfully detain refugees. So very much, things are difficult at the moment. But somehow my research and engagement with this topic is really about trying to sort of discern, I suppose, forms of life that emerge in what are deathly situations. So really not focusing solely on the death and violence, but of course not eliding it, but thinking really about how people manage the kinds of lives they manage to live despite everything, right? So I've been using this phrase, forms of life, which comes from the work of Sylvia Wynter, really important work, where she's sort of, Winter's really speaking about the relationship between representation and the category or the definitions of the human. And so Wynter writes about how representational practices birth forms of life that are specific to each culture, that in turn produce categories that we refer to as human. And of course, she's talking about the Enlightenment European kind of human with a capital H. But I think there is this is a kind of this idea that forms of life or representation produces kind of forms of life and different definitions of the human is something that really often gets forgotten in work that has a kind of humanitarian tilt to it, right? So certainly that's the case with work on migration. So in thinking about migration and borders, I'm sort of trying to focus on the different ways in which life is reproduced despite the continued and brutal violence of the border regime. Because, border regimes produce one or several categories of human, whether it's, the criminal migrant or, the sort of abject victim, etc. But actually when people cross borders, when they're moving across spaces, they're also producing categories of being and living, and somehow how to account for that is really a question of representation. Migration discourse has a huge problem with representation. I think we'll all have seen these kinds of images of migration maps in the popular media with kind of, arrows that sort of speak about the movement of people across large distances, and the arrows all point towards Europe or North America, ignoring, of course, the large scale and often very complex movement of people across, within, let's say, the continent of Africa, for example, or within regions of Asia or Africa or other places. So this poster that you see on the screen is from an exhibition from this project, Topological Atlas, that I've been working on for quite some time. It's a representation of journeys. So it's a list of places mentioned during kind of interviews and conversations with people on the move, in order of their appearance in our conversation. A journey in itself, as the title says. And if you look at it carefully, I mean, one thing to say of this is obviously it's kind of moving away from this kind of directionality, right, of representation that comes with the kind of migration maps with arrows. But the other thing to say is that when you look at these journeys carefully, you see that certain places return again and again within the same kind of conversation. And you think about whether, is that because somebody's being shunted back and forth across borders, or is it the fact of the way they are recalling their journey, right? Because we know that in traumatic kind of situations, people don't always recall them in these kind of linear, perfect lines, right? And this is also then, I would say, a kind of commentary on the asylum interview, this kind of cornerstone of how we decide to, or decide not to, bestow asylum to people who come to our shores for refuge. And so the asylum interview is very much about being able to tell the story in a logical, linear way, despite all of the trauma, right? And if you get it wrong, then that's a reason to deny asylum. So to consider forms of life that emerge within highly unequal and devastating situations, such as the journeys portrayed here, I think requires a different way of looking, but it also requires a discourse beyond that of mere agency. So I'm not going to bore you with the kind of whole background of the discourse around agency and migration studies, but it's certainly quite a big topic. But suffice it to say that, I don't think this map shows a straightforward idea of agency. Yes, people have a kind of, they have an agency in choosing whether to go on these journeys or not, but it's kind of difficult. It's very contingent somehow. And so Abdul Malik Simone, the urbanist, sort of writes of this kind of agency in relation to, the lives of people, the urban poor in the South, sort of the very precarious lives people lead. And so within that work, Simone really speaks about things like negotiating, making deals, positioning yourself in various ways, brokering to get by. So you're always somehow hedging your bets, right, to get things done. And some of this way can really be seen in the kind of, in these journeys that I've been looking at over the last few years. And so I guess there's something about, if we move away, let's say, from the shores of Europe, if I can use that shorthand, then we get somewhere else. We get to a different kind of idea of agency. So this image you see is a bus station on the edges of the Pakistani megacity of Karachi. It's a place where a lot of people sort of start their journeys or end up in the beginning, right? So, sorry, I forgot to say that the project that I've been working on, Topological Atlas, is really looking at migration from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran towards Europe. And so we've been doing a lot of work at the Pakistan-Iran border, but also at the Iran-Turkey border. So this is a place where a lot of the journeys start that we're looking at. And it's a place where the smuggling of goods really overlaps with the clandestine movement of people. And what you find is that there's a kind of community that is coalescing around these smuggling practices that supports both an economy and a way of life. And so to pay attention to these communities that somehow coalesce around the border, understood in all of its complexities, so the border not as a line in the sand, but a border that emerges through various practices, whether it's somebody asking you for an ID, or checking if you can cross a particular checkpoint, etc. And so when we pay attention, to the kind of the complexity of the border, it doesn't reveal perfect victims for humanitarian redress, and that's an important point again within migration discourse, where we need the perfect victim to root for, right? But that's not what you find here. What you find instead are, the various forms of precarious labor that service everyday aspects of the border. So, I don't know, the kind of the border official who might check IDs at random, who you could maybe pay off with the right amount of money, or the smuggler who might help you pass through a checkpoint unnoticed, somewhere near the Pakistan-Iran border, the smuggler who was once a migrant themselves, right? So you see these kinds of different personas, different positions that people take on, or, the young boy who might make you chai along the way. These are all incredibly important actors in the functioning of borders and the displacements and the unsettlements that they produce. So this image is shifting a little bit away from Pakistan. Now, this image is of a Syrian activist that I met in Istanbul, and he's sort of drawing his journey of escape from Syria quite soon after the revolution started there. And he insists on calling himself an exile, not a refugee. And while he understands that the Syrian conflict did produce a lot of refugees, he doesn't think of himself as a refugee. He considers those people to be in much more need than he is. And the map that he drew as we talked, by the way, he's a graphic designer, so he was sort of working with an activist collective that was trying to sort of expose the brutalities of the Assad regime, which is why he had to leave Syria very early on in the revolution. But you can see he's drawn this kind of perfect map because of his skills. And what it really shows is this kind of circulatory movement of people between Syria and Lebanon, circulatory movement that he made between Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey, trying to find a way to live and to carry on his work. So really the racial production of contemporary borders is somehow, I would say, designed to keep people moving rather than keep them out, although of course that is also part of the same very brutal system. But to keep people moving, a system of circulation where deportation regimes, precarious lives, and militarized borders all work together to produce what is essentially a global underclass that's kind of both wanted and not wanted between what we could call the sort of fortified spaces of northern privilege. And somebody like Harsha Valia has written a lot about this, particularly within the context of temporary migration, which is a little different. But sort of in trying to come to grips with the system of circulation and how it sort of affects people caught within it, I've been thinking about how temporality comes into play. So I've been thinking about this kind of notion of the persistent present. So often deportation regimes work in a way where time is almost kind of mobilized to control people. So asylum applications can take years for people wait for their asylum applications to go through. But then, once a decision is made, you have to leave within hours. This is very standard practice in the UK. But also, I think there's something about the temporality that is sort of crucial, something about temporality that's crucial about sort of discerning the possibilities also within this kind of very harsh system, the possibilities for living otherwise within mechanisms of control. So there's something about the temporality that operates within, for example, that bus station in Karachi where, you can see something else emerging in that kind of temporality of brokerage, of deal making. There's something else happening that allows people to kind of make different kinds of decisions. So this image, and this is the last one I'll show before we play the film. This image is of an Afghan woman I met in Odessa in 2016. So she had got there with an agent who'd sort of, dropped her and her family off. And it was only when she met a lawyer that she realized she was not in Europe, which is what she'd paid to get to, where she'd paid to get to, but she was in Ukraine. And so, her account speaks of the difficulties of the journey by road that lasted more than a month, the heaviness she feels in waiting for her life to restart. But she sort of started drawing her map with that little circle in the middle of the page, which sort of denoted a place that she had tried to leave several times, which was her home in Afghanistan, because her and her family were trying to escape the Taliban. And when speaking of her life, she drew these kind of lines that came out of the circle and then back again, each one sort of denoting a journey that had been curtailed, essentially. And then at one point, she stopped and wrote that number in the corner of the image, 25,000, which is the amount that they paid in US dollars to the agent to get them to Europe. And so the video shows her writing the number. I don't have time to show the video, but at one point, she sort of underscores it with a hand gesture. And, in that this work was part of a large research project, funded by the European agencies, we were not allowed to show anyone's faces, and we can talk about the ethics of that, right? What that kind of very straightforward idea of ethics and representation really does. And so for me, it was really important to think about how, the humanity of the person that we were showing was still to be somehow found, and I think that hand gesture really did it. But also, if anybody is from the South Asian context, you might recognize the fabric of her sleeves, which is this kind of thin lawn material, which is very, you see it and immediately you think of home. I think of home. So there are certain things that kind of, connect you to who this person is. So now we're gonna play the film in a second, but I just wanted to say, it's only 10 minutes long, but it sort of deals with some of the kind of issues that I've raised here. It sort of deals with the question of circulation and this idea of unsettlement that borders produce. It sort of deals with the question of the temporalities of borders, so really thinking with colonial time, right, the time of colonial borders, but also the time of brokerage as well. And of course, it also deals with the question of precarious labor.
Thank you, Nishat. That was really, really moving, poetic, resonant. It's a difficult act to follow, so I'm not going to try. But what I'm going to do is pick up on this idea of settlement and unsettlement. And my examples will be to do with North Kensington, the other side of where the college is, the South Kensington part of the Royal College of Art, into the north. And I think settlement and this idea of kind of unsettlement, it might be that actually the word settlement is often a euphemism for unsettlement. Josie was mentioning the townships of South Africa, where these places are officially called improvised and informal settlements. That word settlement is used to actually describe something that's actually unsettled. And I was thinking about it in terms of my own work, because my work on playgrounds has been very much concerned with 1950s, 60s and 70s, a time that's often talked about as the post-war settlement. And one of the things I want to show you is how unsettled that period was. That actually, those terms of settlement that both suggest stability on the one hand and agreement on the other, will unravel as soon as you kind of look at them in detail. The idea of that post-war settlement is that there was somehow a compromise or an arrangement, an agreed, settled arrangement between capital, the voraciousness of capital on the one hand, and the interests of labour on the other. And somehow the idea is that for a period of time, the Tory party agreed to have a kind of like a managed economy and to do quite a lot for workers' rights, and the Labour Party agreed not to push for total kind of socialism. Now, one of the quotes that I'm very fond of at the moment is this one by Walter Benjamin, and it's to do with revolution. And he's talking about Marx here. He says, Marx says that revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but perhaps it's quite otherwise. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers on the train, namely the human race, to activate the emergency brake. And it's this kind of flip that Benjamin does, where he says that actually, what we think of in terms of kind of revolution, these kind of great kind of disruptive energies, are not the kinds of things that the people want. The revolutions, these disruptions, as we know from just watching Trump over the last few days, are what capitalism is all about. Capitalism is the disruptor, is the unsettler. And I think if we look at kind of North Kensington in this period, we will see how kind of unsettling those forces are. Okay. Let's head towards North Kensington. I mean, it's quite often called Notting Hill, the area I'm going to be talking about. But as one of my informants said, Notting Hill is the name of a film. North Kensington is the name of a place. So I'm going to call it kind of North Kensington. And it's kind of often known from photographs that were in the period that I'm talking about, particularly kind of Roger Main's Southern Street photographs, where we see kids, young people, young adults kind of playing in the street, and they're kind of like this kind of idea of kind of owning the street or having a kind of presence on the street. And it's these kind of images, I think, that kind of often give us maybe a kind of a false idea of the place and the time. I mean, I think unusually it's kind of they're photographs of Roger Main, who was a left-wing photographer, took photographs for New Left Review, going into a place and trying to show kind of deprivation, but ends up showing incredible vitality. You know, if anything, these are photographs about kind of street energy as much as anything. Now, North Kensington is certainly in the period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s is kind of unusual. What you have in the borough, the royal borough of Royal Borough of Chelsea and Kensington, is perhaps a microcosm of what kind of Marxists talk about as kind of uneven development. You know, incredible differences in wealth. So you have South Kensington, some of the kind of richest housing, some of the wealthiest people kind of living in London, and you have North Kensington at this time, which was often full of you know, the most kind of dilapidated housing that was possible, and chronic overcrowding. So, for instance, in the area of the Goulburn, where is it? The Goulburn ward, there was something like, I think it was the kind of the highest amount of overcrowding in the whole of Europe was in that area of North Kensington. I think it was something like, I've got the figures here, but I don't seem to be able to quite find them. I think it's roughly like 1.5. I think the percentage was something like 40% of the housing had more than 1.5 people in every single room, and that was including every, you know, the kind of living rooms and the dining rooms and places like this. So we have kind of North Kensington filled with overcrowding, filled with kind of substandard housing, and also with excessive amounts of slum landlords. So people being kind of not just given kind of the worst housing, but made to pay an awful lot of money for the worst housing. And one of the kind of aspects of this is the racial mix of the people kind of living there. And I think one of the things I'm kind of interested in is when you start looking at this kind of post-war period and the post-war settlement, and you start looking at it not from, you know, maybe the kind of the workers of kind of British Leyland factories, but if you start looking at it from the perspective of children or from immigrant communities, you see it actually helps you to unsettle this picture of kind of post-war settlement. And one of the things that the area became increasingly known for was kind of racism, and that came to a head in the Notting Hill riots of 1958. But that riot, that kind of moment of kind of explosion, was a moment. What you have are targeted groups of fascists moving into that area to drum up hate. So you have the White Defence League, who are kind of working there. You have Oswald Mosley's union movement, the rebranded British Union of Fascists. So they're working to do that kind of unsettling. They're part of that kind of unsettling. So we've got massive overcrowding, terrible housing, we've got racism, and also we've got kind of new things happening, new things taking place, which in the case for this area of North Kensington was the building of the Westway. So the building of the Westway is coming in. It's destroying lots of communities, and it's kind of rupturing the space. So within this kind of place, within this kind of period, you have lots of forces of disruption, lots of forces kind of producing some of the kind of worst conditions that you've got. And how that kind of affected children was particularly kind of evident. So, for instance, people kind of looked at the difference between what was happening in South Kensington and what was happening in North Kensington, and they were showing that in South Kensington, a single child shared 1/10 acre with 9 other children. So that was that kind of that space where it had kind of nine children. In North Kensington, the same area was shared with 89 other children. So this is a kind of extraordinary kind of differences of provision, of wealth, of spatial wealth. The same thing is kind of true with housing. There's one street in Colville Gardens where in 1967 this street of 9 houses has 72 tenancies living there, which amounted to 210 people living in these 9 houses. And amongst them were 72 children. And the gardens for these houses were barbed wired. Children weren't allowed to kind of play in them. The gardens, which were often in a lot of the squares of these kind of Georgian areas, were locked and barricaded and just kind of overgrown, just kind of not in use. So the children had to play in the street. We saw them in Roger Main's photographs. What we don't see there is children getting run over. We don't see there children being arrested by the police for being out and about, for being kind of in a kind of non-place. So one of the things that kind of emerges at this time is the idea of the city itself as an agent in kind of criminalising young people, especially young black boys, who are taking up the kind of a huge percentage of kind of the juvenile courts going through. So in South Kensington, we have this condition where there's space, there's public space for these children, but they've also, a lot of them have got kind of private gardens. In North Kensington, not only are there absolutely no private gardens, but there's also this absolute kind of deficit of kind of space out there. So this is the kind of context in which there was a kind of politics of play kind of emerged. And it's this that's kind of interesting to me. I mean, one of the things that happens in conditions of strife is that people get together, they campaign. And one of the things that you get in North Kensington at this time is just an extraordinary amount of community action groups. I'll give you a list of some of them. The Notting Hill People's Association, the North Kensington Play Space Group, the Project Organising Committee, Notting Hill Community Workshop, the New Left Club, the London Free School, a huge amount of tenants associations, West London Anti-Fascist Youth Committee, the Afro-Asian Club, the Association of the Advancement of Coloured People, the Coloured People's Progressive Association, and on and on and on. So you have this kind of splintering of kind of groups. But one of the things that happens is that kind of play somehow kind of energizes people together. It starts off particularly with this adventure playground, which was set up in 1959 in the Notting Hill area. It was called Notting Hill Adventure Playground, and it was there to try and kind of change the kind of narratives around kind of racism, to give kind of space to the kids to do something. But it was also a kind of interestingly kind of embattled space. It has kind of walls all around it. It has kind of barbed wire, and it has chain link kind of fencing around that. And a lot of that was to keep people out, not to keep the kids in. It was to keep out the truancy officers. It was to keep out the police, who were often, wanting to say, okay, well, we've seen these kind of kids. They've been on the rob. They're hiding their kind of stolen goods in your playground. But actually, the play workers were kind of adamant that this was a kind of safe space, that that kind of work wouldn't happen. So this adventure playground became like something of a kind of beacon for the area. And it became a kind of model for other kind of actions. And one of the things that happened was that all the kind of, amazing kind of number of groups I was talking about kind of formed coalitions, and they formed coalitions around the idea of kind of creating space for children. Partly because children were getting killed. They were getting killed by cars using the area as kind of rat run. And one of the things that was with the coalition was that the churches became involved, and they would ring the bells of the churches every time a child got knocked down. And so people were kind of galvanized around this kind of spatial inequality, this kind of injustice around space, and campaigned to get the council to buy Paris Square Gardens, and this was one of the kind of major kind of activities, and they ended up kind of buying that square, and then trying to tarmac it and turn it into a kind of really conventional playground. So again, another kind of action came along to stop that happening. Another aspect of this kind of coalition around kind of play and around kind of children was these kind of incredible activities in 1968 and 69, which were called the Summer of Play, where the idea was, I think in 1968 they asked for 200 student volunteers to come into the area and just kind of turn the whole area into a kind of playground. So these would be the streets that had become rat runs, would be kind of reclaimed as kind of play streets through these actions, and they kind of involved kind of loads and loads of different people. I mean, it's interesting that when these kind of coalitions formed, it wasn't simply through saying, okay, well the lives of children, the safety of children is the ultimate goal. They actually got together and and a lot of these kind of groups also formed much more effective housing associations, tenants associations for changing the conditions of housing. So these are kind of like extraordinary kind of moments where play really became a kind of centre of kind of political life. In 1966, the Notting Hill Adventure Playground got itself a kind of permanent site with a kind of permanent building. The building itself was purpose-built as a kind of playground, so you can climb onto the roof of the building, and there's kind of record players, and there's a slide down off the roof, and there's a whole kind of range of kind of indoor kind of activities, and these were kind of playgrounds that were meant to be, where you could spend all your time there. You could spend an entire summer. You could spend an entire weekend making things and kind of producing space. And the kind of last thing I want to kind of point to is the way that the Westway itself became a kind of focus for this. The Westway was seen by a lot of people in North Kensington as an absolute kind of intrusion that they knew wouldn't happen if it was in a wealthy area. These roads don't get built in wealthy areas. These roads get built where people couldn't care less about the housing that's going to be kind of knocked down and the communities that are going to be destroyed. But one of the things that happened around this was the Westway itself became a site for turning it into something else. And the kind of the undercroft of the kind of motorway area became a kind of place of play, of kind of adventure playgrounds, of these kind of summer schools, and the plan was that the whole thing would be turned into a number of kind of community kind of elements. Okay, I'm gonna wrap this up. So we have this kind of idea of kind of settlement, of kind of post-war settlement, and we can see that capitalism is this kind of destructive, unsettling force. We know that street of 9 houses that had 270 people living in there, that now, if you want to buy a 2-bedroom flat, you're going to be looking at kind of £2 million. So we know that this kind of unsettling is what kind of capitalism does, what kind of capitalism kind of throws up. But at the same time, we're duty bound to look at it from other perspectives, to see what actually happens when these things kind of take place. What actually gets kind of provoked by the community, a community that's kind of much more interested in kind of recognising that unsettlement, but also producing new kinds of settlement within those kind of places. And I think what we get with these kind of improvised playgrounds, some of them don't last for a particularly long time. Some of them did. I mean, the venture, the Notting Hill Adventure Playground, is still going today. But that kind of sense of a kind of improvised way of kind of taking up space and kind of talking back to kind of spatial injustice with a kind of another model is, I think, something that we need to kind of hold on to, a sense of both site and situation, where the everyday kind of shows kind of possibilities. And it's those possibilities that I think are kind of worth hanging on to. I don't think they're utopian. I don't think an adventure playground is a kind of utopia. I think it's a makeshift utopia. I think it kind of points to some kind of potentialities of living differently, of using space differently. And I think one of the things it does do, and one of the things that a lot of these kind of examples do, is kind of point to what Raymond Williams talked about as a kind of ethics, really, a kind of ethics for the work that people in communities do, but also the ethics of people who kind of write about this kind of stuff. and that is this kind of ethics of that Williams talked about in terms of, I'm quoting here, where he said, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And I think we live at a moment where it's really, really difficult not to find kind of despair quite convincing. And it almost kind of like feels like an incredible kind of ethical obligation to try and rescue these kind of moments of hope, of possibility and potentiality from this kind of chronic situation. Thank you.
So just wanted to say thank you so much for the presentations. There were some wonderful resonances and synchronicities, as well as talking about very different periods of time and temporalities and locations. And Josie and I thought for the first kind of question would be nice actually to invite you both to respond to each other, because the whole point was to put you in discussion. So literally to put you in discussion before you invite our interventions or the audiences. Would you like to say anything about each other's presentations?
Should I start? Yeah, I thought your last image was really interesting. I mean, I'm an architect by training, and a lot of the work that I've been doing with others, of course, has been about kind of trying to think about architecture beyond the built object. So those images that you had of the Westway next to the playground is, you know, I co-wrote a book a long time ago called Spatial Agency, which is absolutely about this idea of how people produce space through social relations. And I was like, oh God, we should have had that in our book, because it was the perfect kind of example of a different way of thinking about architecture. And so because I do work on migration, really it's that way of thinking architecture through spatial relations that I've really been trying to work with. So yeah, that's what I found really striking right at the end.
Thank you. Yes, I think kind of architectural thinking is kind of part of what I was kind of interested in. I mean, for me, one of the things that I kind of really found sort of really emphatic in your work was the sound. The sound is, because it cuts out at some point, that kind of drone, that kind of thing, and then when it comes back in, it's really, really affecting and really kind of very kind of atmospheric, but also very, very kind of sinister, and kind of sets up this kind of. I mean, I'm kind of very interested in the kind of the whole poetics of your work, which is very kind of strong, and how that kind of relates to what you're talking, you know, the topic.
It's really well, it's very interesting, but what's strange is that I wrote the kind of text for that film just in one go, and it had been after I'd been doing kind of, you know, doing a lot of work in Pakistan and in Turkey. COVID had just happened, so we couldn't go on field work anymore. And I was just feeling so full of these stories and not able to write the standard kind of academic text, not able to really reflect on anything. And it was a way of just somehow getting out a lot of the very difficult stories that I'd heard, the kind of emotion. So I guess it just came through in a way that I'm not really able to kind of pick apart, as it were. But yeah, it was kind of weird for me to.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I might need to grab a mic.
You start.
Yeah, shall I? Okay. Yeah, so thanks both so much for your presentations. That it's so kind of provocative in the good sense. My mind is kind of like just pinging off all of these ideas, but I think I keep coming back to a similar question, a similar perspective, which is that in both your related yet very different ways, you're attempting to uncover some aspects of the kind of the eclipsed or the forgotten or the improper, the makeshift, the everyday, with a particular agenda, ultimately, one might think. And I mean, Ben, at the end of your talk, you had this lovely phrase, talking back to spatial injustice. to make another world. Oh, sorry, with another model. And I'm very curious about how, in a sense, you understand your process, your method, your mission, if you want, and how that then kind of reflects back onto yourself, where you stand vis-a-vis the subjects, the histories, the lives that you're researching, that you're articulating, and yet you're not necessarily directly a part, or are you? It's a question. So it's a kind of question about positionality, but also your real intention with focusing on the often obscured, the vulnerable, minoritized, displaced, and so forth. Because you work in certain ways, and you both focus the visual in your work, so that's kind of the reason I'm very interested.
Yes, I mean, I think I was very kind of aware of that. I mean, partly I think because I think it's very, well, I think kind of cultural studies, the kind of humanities really does kind of veer between heavy kind of critique or kind of proselytizing and saying, this is absolutely kind of fantastic. And I was very kind of struck that actually it would be very easy for me to, and I'm sort of drawn to that, to kind of proselytize and say, actually these things are kind of fantastic, they need funding, the withdrawal of funding from these things is kind of terrible. But at the same time, I kind of really wanted to hang on to a kind of dialectic, in which case the playgrounds saying to a city, we're gonna get a kind of discrete bit of space here, and kids are going to be safe in this. They're not going to be run over. They're not going to be arrested. They're not going to be kind of criminalized. That wasn't a cure. That doesn't solve spatial injustice. In fact, it's a kind of temporary kind of amelioration. But that doesn't. But that again, then you could think, okay, well, actually, that kind of, that just kind of adds to the problem. That kind of adds to the problem of seeing the city as a kind of hostile environment for children, and it kind of plays into that. Now, sometimes amelioration or a kind of band-aid, a sticking plaster on things, is kind of necessary. It's better than nothing. So it's kind of working, keeping in mind that kind of the bigger sense that the city is kind of criminalizing kind of young people, especially young kind of black boys particularly, and seeing this thing as some kind of answer. There was one aspect of it that was this idea of a kind of a walled space, a kind of carceral space. When they make the new Notting Hill Adventure Playground, I think there's concrete walls that are 8 foot high, with another 4 foot of chain link fence kind of around the top. I mean, it couldn't look more like somewhere it was impossible to escape from. But one of the things that comes out of that is that people kind of produce new kinds of intimacy within that space. But you're getting a lot of kind of radical architects saying, oh my God, having walls, having kind of chain link fence is the worst possible thing that you could have. And one of the, this is kind of put to various kind of play workers, and they said, yeah, you're probably right. We shouldn't have chain link fence. But if it comes to the point where we don't need chain link fence, we won't need adventure playgrounds either. So that's the...
But how do you sort of understand your work of uncovering these histories where you have a real attunement and attention to what might be seen as a kind of minority subject, like wallpaper in your work on brutalism, these small temporary playgrounds. How do you see the work of recovery and I guess articulation, contextualization? how does that relate to politics? I'm interested also in chat with you, like where does, in a sense, scholarship, where does it head, and how does it operate, and how does this sort of recovery work? How does it operate?
Well, I suppose that's always been, the work that I've kind of done on kind of everyday life has always been about kind of recovering kind of minor things, the overlooked, the undervalued, all those things. So that kind of putting them into the kind of foreground, I think, for me, has a kind of politics of itself that maybe is kind of aesthetic kind of politics of just changing the focus of things. I mean, I think there's kind of particular things around that. I mean, I think for me it is this kind of politics of neither kind of total critique on the one hand, or a kind of kind of easy celebration on the other. It's that kind of difficult idea of kind of trying to kind of tell these stories and kind of try and tell them well, and try and be as kind of true to the people involved as possible. Not trying to kind of ventriloquize on their behalf, but actually to give those stories the kind of space and time they need, without necessarily being kind of judgmental, but kind of allowing them to have their own kind of articulation, their own kind of politics.
One sub-question within this: do you ever work with subjects that you're writing about? Do you work with residents? I'm just interested in the kind of the texture of that discourse of subject and positionality.
Yes. If I was you, I'd be able to say yes. Yes, I do. No, because it's so kind of historical. I talk to people who were involved. Yeah. But yes, it's a kind of. I mean, I am sort of involved in kind of playgrounds that are kind of in existence now, in where I live and things like that. But actually, that's more kind of your area, is it?
I guess one thing I would say around migration discourse is that, it's very overexposed, actually. The kind of the figure of the migrant is everywhere, right, in very many difficult ways in the popular media, there's so much written about migration in academic circles. So in many ways, you're dealing with this overrepresented figure, actually. And so for me, the interest was in, well, how do you tell a different story? And in telling that, how do you tell it from a different position, right? So, of course, I'm not I did sort of move to the UK as a migrant, but, I didn't move as an undocumented migrant. So, so for me, there's something about, definitely telling the stories from the South. I think I mentioned that in the presentation, that, when I didn't go into it, but there's a whole discourse on the autonomy of migration and migration studies, which is very much about, giving agency to the people who are crossing borders, and not saying that, the border regimes people are just caught in it and they have no decision-making power, that people make decisions to go on journeys. And I do agree with that, but I think some of that kind of very activist literature comes from a position that is very much European. So, the spaces where people speak to people in, undocumented migrants, etc., in the Greek islands, it's in southern Italy, it's essentially at the shores of Europe, as I said. And when you move away from Europe and you start looking from the south, from Pakistan in my case, different stories emerge, the same stories but with a different flavor. And so I think that for me was really important in terms of positionality. Of course, I'm still, I have a British passport, so I'm highly privileged in that sense. And I think all of the conversations that I have with people are marked by this privilege, right? I can move across borders. I didn't show it this time, but I usually have a map of our project research team, which is very big, spread across kind of, UK, Europe, Pakistan, India, Turkey. I show the kind of lines of people who go on these journeys of migration, and then our privilege lines, which are, loops, because we've gone on flights, essentially. And so that's definitely there as a question mark, and underscores every conversation you have. How can it not? So, yeah.
I know I follow on and on, but I'm
I was interested in that you quoted Sylvia Wynter and this idea of representations bringing life into being in the way that, and in relation to Ben, what you said about refusing despair and looking for models of hope. I just wondered if you wanted to say something about that in the representations you've brought into being, in terms of, is that something you both share, perhaps? But I thought it was interesting in relation to Winter as well, the idea that you bring other worlds into view through representation, even the possibility of other worlds, and that's just so important as well.
Yeah, I mean, some of the work that map, it's not a map, it's a list of names of places, was doing was to bring, some tiny village in some very, I guess, for want of a better word, remote area of Balochistan and Pakistan into conversation with, I don't know, London, Istanbul, etc., and to understand that these geographies are part of the simultaneous and the lives of the people that we're speaking of. For them, one place is equally as important as the other because of their kind of life journey. So some of that, I think, that was a representational move away from, always centering the place that you're going to, the directionality of movement, etc.
Hi, Ben, I have a question for you. I found it interesting how you talked about play not necessarily as a way to reclaim public space, but as a way to, at first, sort of create new spaces that are cordoned off until public space may become available to play. But then I was wondering, what about adult play and the way that adult play can be used to actually make public space, which is no longer often public, often privatized and so on. Like I'm thinking about city squares, which were often, used recreationally, used as protest spaces, used as highly multi-purpose spaces, which now seem to be rather like images of themselves, aestheticized, regulated, controlled by the state. And so how do we reclaim space as play space, especially, also for adults, in a way that is more public rather than cordoned off?
Yes, well, I mean, kind of one of the examples of the kind of the Paris Square, where you saw that kind of very kind of nice kind of demonstration where they have the kind of placards and things. But actually, a week or two later, after that, what they did was they just kind of tore down the fence, and they tore down the fence mainly because they were a kind of group of anti-Vietnam kind of merry pranksters. They did it kind of partly as kind of theatrical thing, and within this kind of, I guess, there's a kind of other aspects of North Kensington that we probably should put in there as well, which is kind of Bohemia, and which is kind of psychedelia, which are kind of street theatre people, a whole kind of range of that, like you say, does kind of think about kind of play as very much something for everyone, not just for kind of kids. And I think that's kind of still alive today. Later today, I'm going down to Eastbourne for a play workers thing. Very different from academia, I'll tell you that. And the people kind of involved in that, there's a lot of them still have this kind of idea of saying, you don't ask for space, you grab it. It's a guerrilla activity. You see a bit of space, you set something up, you kind of do something. So there is that kind of much more kind of yippie, I guess, activist kind of theatre kind of play aspect in that history, and there's kind of possibilities of that, I think, kind of for today.
I had a question also about the playgrounds, because I was wondering if the unions were also involved in parts of it. Also, the union.
Oh yeah.
Also, yeah, where did they get this space from? Because they made like a fence around it. Also, if there has been like analysement about like what was present on the playground, because it looked like quite simple constructions. And I was wondering, because a lot of people discuss that today we maybe over organize playgrounds, if that has become a discussion of like how these guerrilla kind of playgrounds maybe like manifest more inspiration for children. And I was wondering if that was part of your research as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think that these kind of playgrounds in London weren't particularly kind of union money wasn't really going into them, but anywhere where the NUM, the National Union of Miners, were involved, absolutely, they were putting loads and loads of money into kind of playgrounds and kind of you know, creating kind of conditions for young people and kind of children. So one of the things that you kind of pick up there is that there isn't a lot of kind of static devices, what they would call static devices, and that's kind of absolute kind of politics of that, which is so one of the people who kind of set up kind of adventure playgrounds in this country had an idea where you actually only spend 10% of your budget on stuff and 90% on salaries. And of course, that's completely gone the other way. Now we spend loads and loads of money on these kind of ridiculously brightly coloured rubber surfaces that you know, don't prepare children for hard stuff. So yeah, so that's a kind of complete kind of change, really.
And don't play any play workers to
no, exactly.
At these
Yeah,
programs.
yes. Investing in people is something that no one wants to do.
Especially not those kind of people.
I spent my early, before I entered art education, I used to work in play work, and radically different aspirations and roles of play workers from now to then, in terms of, as you say, so much discourse now is just around the structures, not about the dialogue, the emotional support, all the other stuff that we used to do as well. I found that very moving because I grew up in North Kensington and used to play in those spaces as well. And I think what you said for both of you about these are not, there's a kind of, they were often quite threatening places as well as being utopian. There were a lot of ways in which certain kinds of play couldn't happen. You know, long form, creative, certain exchanges couldn't. But yeah, I think that different emphasis between static architecture and kind of human relations, very, very different. But yeah, thank you. Any more questions?
Can I just quickly ask about the use of images in your work? Because on the one hand, there's the kind of archival image, which seems like a kind of movement in time, and then on the other hand, there's the kind of film essay, which is a kind of movement in space. And I was struck by, particularly with the archival image, what you were saying, Ben, about what wasn't in the image. You know, the idea of children being run over, and the kind of horror of playing in the street that wasn't captured in those kind of everyday images that are kind of almost idealized in these spaces. And then also with the moving image that we saw, the photo essay, you know, as kind of, not photo, sorry, film essay, the idea of how you kind of, what dialogue you have with that image in your work, and how that different use of the visual impacts on your thinking differently, if at all.
I think a lot of the kind of images that are there, somebody else made a comment about it, that a lot of the images have been taken from a moving vehicle or something. And that really says something about the situation of the places that we were in, particularly in the south of Pakistan, in the Balochistan province, where it's very difficult to actually take, to take film. And so you always have to kind of step back. It's a very securitized area. If you don't have the kind of identity card from that province, it's very difficult to spend a lot of time there. And so some of it was just the practicalities of what it means, to film in these areas. But also, I think some of the way in which the images were being used, and I meant to say this also in the kind of positionality question, that there's a moment where in the narration where you are asked, right, how much money do you have? What can you do? And I think the images sometimes try to sort of disrupt that feeling and try to bring you, the viewer, into the work to think, well, what would you do in that situation, I suppose. And yeah, there are other motifs like the leaves that come back that refer to this idea of the sabz-bagh, which is a kind of term in Urdu that, you know, literally sort of translates to green garden, but it's really about, you know, somebody might show you a sabz-bagh, it means they might show you something beautiful, right, that you can get to. So that's somehow a comment on what the agents tell people, you know, it will be like this. But at the same time, it's a kind of a mirage as well. So when people are on these long journeys, they end up kind of being quite disoriented in many ways. So often they will be in a fairly stable situation, but they won't call back home. And there's a lot of people that have young people that have spoken to, young men especially, and because they're always waiting, right? Waiting for that moment when they're a bit more settled, when everything is a little bit better, and you get caught in this kind of particular temporality, but also this idea of, you know, getting to that sabz-bagh, as it were, this other place. So some of that was also in the images.
I was very struck by the, I mean, some of those images are kind of virtual renderings, are they? Like through the kind of valley to the kind of the mountains and the water, kind of that kind of, you know, there's a kind of real kind of dreamlike quality. And there's such a kind of quotidian aspect to, you know, certainly that kind of first set of photographs of images where you're seeing these kind of weird kind of reflections as kind of much as anything. I mean, was that kind of that sense of that kind of virtual rendering? I mean, it's very dreamy. Was that kind of part of?
Yeah, I was trying to evoke this idea of, we were working a lot with this idea of the dreams and delusions that borders produce, that sometimes the agents produce a certain kind of sort of narrative that you sort of follow, but then also that you tell yourself a certain story in order to keep going, right? So in some other work I speak a lot about how mosques become really important places for people on the move, because they almost become like this an oasis within a very difficult kind of situation, a moment of respite. And often in the kind of very long sort of conversations we've had with people, they speak of them in very dreamlike ways. You know, we were by a stream, there was a pear tree, and I sat there. And of course, I don't know, it's maybe a way of dealing with very difficult situations. It's a way of kind of recalling something. So it goes back to the idea of not being able to tell a standard linear story of a journey. So yeah, some of that I was sort of trying to bring that into.
Thank you, Nishat and Ben. Ben, a question for you, or maybe it's part observation. I was really struck by, I don't know if it's your quotation of yourself, but Notting Hill is the name of a film, and North Kensington is the name of a place. And this was in relation to that series of Roger Main photographs. And you know, I was thinking of the film Notting Hill, and I remember a film from 1988, I think, called Absolute Beginners, which was based on a book by Colin McInnes, written in 1959, which has as one of its sort of centerpieces the so-called Notting Hill riots. And I saw that, the image from Michael Putland, which looks cinematic. Was that a documentary image? Because it looks as if it's on a film set. The one with the Trader Horn shop and...
I don't know. Sorry, I don't know about that. Yeah, it does. I mean, it does look like it's staged, doesn't it? Like the lighting's incredible. I mean, interestingly, you mentioned Absolute Beginners. The first cover of Absolute Beginners had a photograph by Roger Main. The same photographer kind of making those of the kind of young woman in the street. But yes, I mean the kind of I mean that's the kind of difficult thing, isn't it? We're so kind of we're so mediatized. We've had so many kind of layers of mediation Now, I think if you were kind of hanging around in the 1950s and 60s, Notting Hill would have been a perfectly fine phrase to use, as would Notting Dale. You know, it would have talked about kind of particular places. The person who made that comment is the photographer Adam Ritchie, who took a lot of the kind of, who was very involved with the kind of place space group, and was kind of that kind of undercroft of the Westway, and he's kind of making it, saying almost like, you know, well this kind of Richard Curtis film has kind of ruined that term. We can't use the word Notting Hill in the same way because of something like that film, and I think that's kind of, you know, that's kind of interesting thing around mediation, I guess. Thank you.
Sorry, oops. Sorry. Yes, I have a kind of practical question. How do the communities where people migrate, how do they document it? Do they have archives? Are there some kind of records kept? This family moved away, or how is this sort of recorded? Did you find any insight into that? Yes.
Well, I'm looking at very contemporary sort of migrations, right? So people moving right now. And so people are caught in this kind of circulation, right? So a lot of the people that I've spoken to come from a very particular place in Pakistan, the Punjab province, and a particular sort of, it's called the migration triangle, no, Gujarat triangle. So it's Gujarat and some other small towns. And it's, for some reason, a lot of people from this place try to make their way, especially to the UK. And so in many ways, it's not that there's a community space or anything, but the stories come back because people are deported. They try again, right? So that particular place, if you go there, there's a whole kind of contemporary history of migration. There are people who speak a very particular version of Urdu and Greek mixed together, which is quite funny to hear. And so, yeah, there's the culture is changing. There's a very different style of housing there because the ones who did make it are sending now a lot of remittances back. So there's a kind of, yeah, it's changing the landscape there. So there probably will eventually be an archive or something, but for now it's very much a kind of oral sort of, archive. There are certain places where a lot of the young men have left. So it's very young, it's usually men, like 99.9% are men. And they tend to be sort of teenagers, sort of, you know, between 15 or upwards to early 20s. So older people don't really do it anymore because it's very difficult, the journey. And so you will often speak to people where one son has gone, maybe lost their lives, and, you know, often, you know, rather than getting compensation from the agent, they would send the next kid along. So there's these very difficult situations that emerge then. I mean, again, in another kind of presentation, I speak a lot about this idea of displacement. We think of displacement as, you know, long kind of, you know, journeys of migration, but actually in these places, displacement is happening without moving. It's happening from these situations, but also from the effects of climate change, of kind of industrial, you know, expansion, you know, degradation of the the city of Lahore is kind of expanding really fast into these village areas. So the degradation of the environment, all of that, you know, is producing what Nixon calls, you know, slow violence, essentially this kind of ecological breakdown, then produces these large-scale migrations.
Yeah, I have a question. Final question. My question is kind of strange because I arrived late, so didn't actually see the video, which was really sad. So I've had this strange experience where I've just been hearing more and more about it without having seen it. So I guess one, is there any way, is it published anywhere? Does it live anywhere online? / are you going to be showing it anywhere else? Yeah, that's one.
We're showing it at the UCL Urban Room, not tomorrow night, but the night after.
Okay.
I'm doing a presentation for the evening. You're welcome.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's not actually available, but I can give you a link and a password if you want to see it.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And then it made me also think about as you said, there's like a lot of academia and writing about migration studies, and I guess and like this overrepresented figure of the migrant. So I'd just love to hear a bit about what you think visualizing all of this research does, and whether that like different mode kind of changes the representation of the figure of the migrant.
Yeah, so one of the reasons the film is the way that it is because it doesn't show anybody. No migrants are shown ever. So you see landscapes, you see kind of animated bits of film, and really the narration puts you almost in the space of the person who's moving, sometimes, not always. But you do sometimes see somebody working in a kind of workshop on the outskirts of Istanbul, for example, and that could be somebody who's a migrant, it could not be. So you don't really know. And partly that was because, I mentioned in the talk that, the ethics is part of this kind of large-scale European project that I was doing, so it comes with very heavy ethical kind of guidelines that you have to follow that come, from hard sciences that are then adopted into arts and humanities. So they're okay, but they restrict you in many ways, and they're very black and white in the way they kind of consider ethics. And so anyway, I was never allowed to show the face of anyone, for example, and so some of the images are of hands, etc. It produces its own problems because, not showing faces, of course, dehumanizes people sometimes. So it's a difficult one, and often I'd speak to people and they would be like, well, tell my name, tell my story. And you're like, I can't. So, yeah.
Will the film be available kind of publicly at some point, do you think?
I should put it online, yeah. The website has not been updated for so long. I've run out of money, essentially.
I'll set up for students here for you.
Yeah,
so
feel free.
We've got the Vimeo link. We can forward it if you write to me or Josie or...
That's probably the easiest way, actually.
Yeah.
Well, so it's interesting that kind of those questions of everyday life and how they inform the quotidian, also inform the scholarship and the types of work that we're all engaged in ways that feel kind of increasingly overbearing, it might be possible to say. So it's good just to have that kind of as a point of conclusion, and also thinking about ways to just take back space, referring to pulling down fences, or just to kind of make claims to certain freedoms. But it's perilous. It's a perilous navigation. Mel, I don't know if you want to say any final remarks or...
No, I think... I suppose one question I have actually is, given the limitations on representation that you had there, is there another film that you want to make as an artist who isn't, who can take more liberty with those kind of institutional, ethical? That's kind of interesting to me. Do you want to show faces? Do you want to tell stories now, or do you think that actually that's provided an identification that we have to do the work?
Yeah, I think the latter, actually, because we have all the kind of the stories of migrants, and but partly I'm trying not to make it a long answer, but definitely I had a disillusionment with the kind of NGO narrative, the kind of the standard sort of way in which migrants are shown, but at the same time within architecture there's this kind of evidentiary sort of turn. Forensic architecture, those kinds of worlds where, everything is about statistics and what's happening. And so I wanted to find something else, and somehow these restrictions allowed me to do something that I feel okay about, actually. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed what this has opened up. Thank you.